Hola, muy buenos días. Bienvenidos a este webinar de la Asociación Española de Franquiciadores que organiza nuestro socio Bird&Bird. Es el cuarto webinar que hace nuestro socio Bird&Bird sobre internacionalizando tu franquicia. En los webinars anteriores hemos visto cuál era la situación de la franquicia en países como Polonia, Reino Unido, Holanda, Australia, China, Italia, Francia y Marruecos. Y ahora, en este cuarto webinar, el último del año, de la mano de nuestro socio Bird&Bird, vamos a ver cuál es la situación, la actualidad de la franquicia en India y Oriente Medio. Y para que nos presente este webinar, tenemos con nosotros a Lourdes Ayala, que es socia responsable de Mercantil y Fusiones y Adquisiciones en Bird&Bird España. Lourdes, buenos días.
Buenos días, Juan Carlos. Muchas gracias y bueno, bienvenidos a todos. Estamos encantados una vez más de poder participar y de poder haber realizado esta serie de webinars sobre cómo atender a las claves de la internacionalización de la franquicia en diferentes jurisdicciones. Como ha dicho Juan Carlos, hemos recorrido el mundo con vosotros. Ahora vamos a tener la oportunidad de nuevo con expertos de nuestras oficinas en cada una de las jurisdicciones hablar de las claves en la India y en Oriente Medio, en particular en Dubái y en Arabia Saudí. Como ha dicho Juan Carlos, la idea de estos webinars es dar un repaso rápido sobre la regulación más relevante a tener en cuenta por una franquiciadora antes de introducirse en una jurisdicción nueva. Hemos observado en esta serie de webinars cómo tienen un sustrato común que se repite de una forma o de otra en cada uno de las jurisdicciones, que básicamente tiene por objeto, como es sabido, la protección de los franquiciados, porque se considera por las jurisdicciones, por las regulaciones de aplicación como la parte más débil y más merecedora de protección. Y básicamente hemos visto que se repiten en casi todas las jurisdicciones, se repite la necesidad de, por ejemplo, hacer un disclosure document, una documentación con carácter precontractual para informar al franquiciado sobre las materias principales de la franquicia, las marcas, el know-how, etc. Más allá de eso, hemos visto también cómo hay relevantes diferencias en las jurisdicciones, incluso de nuestro entorno más cercano, y cómo esas diferencias hay que atenderlas incluso antes de iniciar los tratos precontractuales. Sirva como ejemplo la necesidad de observar y de elegir al socio para ver si realmente va a existir dependencia económica en el franquiciado respecto del franquiciador, porque vimos, por ejemplo, en Italia y en Francia, cómo eso podría luego conllevar multas o sanciones de un abuso de la posición de dependencia económica que pudieran llegar a ser muy relevantes en Italia y en Francia. Por lo tanto, bueno, dicho esto, vamos a pasar ya a presentar a nuestros compañeros de hoy, que van a hablar sobre las jurisdicciones relevantes en el día de hoy. I go and switch into English now to introduce my colleagues. First, Melissa Murray, who I've known for a lot of years. She specializes in franchising and advising franchisors and master franchisees when entering into the Middle East, specifically UAE and Saudi Arabia. So, and then Nipun, Gupta and Sudipta Routh will speak about the Indian market and the Indian regulations. They are both specialized in mergers and acquisitions, and we'll talk about also the main issues when entering into the Indian market. So Melissa, the floor is yours if you want to start whenever you want. Melissa, I think you're mute.
Of course, sorry. Everyone has to do it. Can I get you to move to the next slide, please?
Yes, sure.
So just to start with, I think it can be helpful to understand what countries I am talking about, because everyone has a bit of a different definition of what's in the Middle East. Here you can see I've got a little map and highlighted in blue and red the countries of the Middle East. I have put in Egypt. It's not technically the Middle East, but it is a very popular market when we list out Middle East countries where international brands like to come and franchise in the region. You will see in red, I've put the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, which is Saudi, Kuwait, the UAE, being the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and obviously Saudi is a very large market. It's the largest country there in red. Lourdes, can I get you to move to the next slide, please? So in the Middle East, the most important thing for franchisors to consider is the agency law. So in every country, there is an agency law, except for relevant to franchising in Saudi, they now have a franchise law. But for all the other countries in the Middle East, you really have to watch out for the agency law. Now, the agency law does differ from country to country, and it has varying consequences depending on which country we're thinking about. So when we talk about the agency law, this is a law in each country which protects the nationals of that country from things like undue termination. There can be consequences relating to compensation on termination. And it really depends on what country we're talking about. So for example, in the UAE is one of the strictest, I would say, in terms of the most protectionist of UAE nationals who act as an agent, being a representative for a brand. Now, the agency law in all of the countries is very broad. So in the UAE, it covers franchising. In most of the countries, it will cover a franchise relationship. But the law was drafted originally in all of the countries. It's meant to cover distribution agreements, the typical distribution agreement that you see. But because it is drafted so broadly, it does cover franchising. Now, for example, in the UAE, if you have a registered commercial agent who is your franchisee, there are a number of consequences to that. And for example, the law will override your arbitration clause. You will have deemed UAE law apply instead of your Spanish governing law clause. The expiry date is automatically cancelled, and it's considered to be a continuous contract where you can, as the franchisor, cannot terminate unless there is a threshold found, which is what we call material justified reasons, which is commonly around missing sales targets or trading in competitive products when there's a very clear non-compete clause. So it's quite a protectionist law, and it's a very strict law, and it has a lot of consequences to it. So that's why it's so important to get legal advice when you're going into these countries, to make sure you don't inadvertently fall into these agency laws, because they can be contracted out of. They can be mitigated and they can be managed if you know what you're doing and how to negotiate the contract and how to put in the right wording and how to manage the franchisee. Then I'll just quickly move to the Saudi franchise law. Now, Saudi Arabia introduced a franchise law about 1.5 years ago. It is the first type of franchise law that we have in the region. Because Saudi has this, there is a potential that the other GCC countries may introduce a franchise law. The franchise law in Saudi is a bit of a blend of what we would see in Australia or America or other countries that have a disclosure requirement. So the Saudi franchise law introduces this disclosure requirement where it's basically a document that you give to the franchisee, which sets out things like very clearly, these are the fees, this is the scope of the franchise agreement, this is the training that the franchisor will give you, these are the rights of termination. And it's almost like a marketing document where you're assuming that the franchisee is not going to read the franchise agreement. You're setting out all the commercials for them. Now, the Saudi franchise law, however, means that there's this obligation that everything is in Arabic. So that disclosure document has to be translated into Arabic, which can be a challenge. Then attached to the disclosure document needs to be the franchise agreement, also in Arabic. So what in practice it has meant is that there's a lot of front loading of costs for franchisors before they can even get a deposit from the franchisee and before they know that the franchisee is a solid prospect. So it's quite an investment on the behalf of a franchisor now. Before the franchise law in Saudi was in place, we had the commercial agency law which applied, and the commercial agency law in Saudi was a very balanced law. It didn't have the same things that the UAE agency law has in it. So previously, when the agency law applied, you could have an arbitration clause, you could have your foreign law, the term of the relationship, the franchise relationship was set, so there was a set expiry date. It didn't override things in your commercial contract like the UAE agency law does. The Saudi agency law was very much a law about in relation to franchising, and it still exists in relation to distribution agreements, but for franchising it doesn't anymore, it's not applicable. But it was very much an import-export law, more related to tracking and making sure that the franchisee and the agent has the right to use that trademark. So it's a very balanced law and it was fine. Now in Saudi we have this franchise law, and there's a lot of steps that an international franchisor has to take at the very beginning of the relationship to make sure that they comply and that they don't inadvertently put themselves into a situation where the franchisee could claim compensation or the franchisee can terminate the relationship because there hasn't been this compliance with a disclosure document or the Arabic language requirements. The Saudi franchise law also have introduced a registration requirement, which is not that different to what the agency law had before, but now we have to register that disclosure document, we have to register the signed franchise agreement, and there are obligations on the franchisor to do that, and there are default measures. If the franchisor doesn't register these documents, then there can be an element of compensation and fines. Lourdes, can I get you to move to the next slide, please? So obviously, outside of the agency law and the franchise law in Saudi, there are a number of other laws which can apply to the franchise relationship. Obviously, we have consumer protection laws all through the region, and they deal with the usual pricing, refunds, acting in good faith, and the usual consumer protection, things that are not so different from any other region. Competition law in the region, it can apply, but usually in our franchise deals, the impact is not so great because most franchisors coming in aren't looking at taking 30% of the market in a specific pizza restaurant chain, for example. So there are certain pricing things when we're talking about apparel brands that are coming into the region. Competition law about the minimum pricing can impact, but it's not so onerous as you might find in other jurisdictions. I've put trademarks here in a few bullet points under trademarks because trademarks can be extremely important when we're talking about franchise deals. The reason they're so important is because all of the countries in the Middle East are first to file. And what we often find is that if you as a franchisor are negotiating a deal with a potential franchisee, that franchisee will go and rush off and register your trademark because you're just in negotiations, and they will use it as a negotiating point with you to say, well, I've got your trademark, so you had better sign with me. I should be your franchisee because I've basically tied up your brand. So it's really important when you start to even think that you might expand within the region that you go and get your trademark registered in the relevant countries. And there's quite a lot of strategic advice which we give clients around that, because you can register in the UAE first and then you have a set time frame in order to go into Saudi and Kuwait, Qatar and the other regions. But I will explain it is quite an expensive process out here. So sometimes clients get shocked at how much a trademark registration can be, but it is really the best protection you can get is to make sure that you've got it in your name and that the franchisee doesn't have it or a third party doesn't have it, because it will flow on the consequences throughout the whole negotiation of the deal if things don't go right with that trademark from day one. I will say I've also put Arabic You need to consider whether or not you need the Arabic translation or transliteration, we call it, to be registered as well, because English and Arabic do not directly translate. So your beautiful logo in Arabic might mean something different. It might not come across well. So we have a team that look at that and they will tailor things for you. But it is very important to also protect the Arabic logo, which is a separate registration. So we're talking 2 registrations, because also we're not multi-class and we don't group filings. So every individual application for the English is one, and then the Arabic is another. And obviously the trademark registration will flow through to signage considerations. In some areas you can have just the English, and for example in Saudi you have both the English and the Arabic on signage. So it can be quite important to make sure that that trademark is correct from day one, and it will flow through the whole deal. Certain countries do have VAT and withholding taxes. Obviously, throughout the region, we have pork and alcohol considerations that can impact some cafeteria brands. And then we do have local shareholding requirements for company-owned outlets. Some brands come to us and they say, I want to open the first few outlets myself, then I will franchise in the region, I'll do the flagship store. But depending on where they're looking at opening, they may need to partner and do a joint venture arrangement with a local shareholder because of our company's law and the local shareholding requirements that we have. Lourdes, can I get the next slide? Thank you. So I'm just going to talk quickly about just commercial considerations, because we get a lot of questions with international brands when they're coming to the region about who should be a franchisee, what's a better franchisee or not. We, especially in the UAE, well, throughout the whole GCC, I would say there are a number of very big family groups who have a large portfolio of franchises. So some of the family groups might have up to 100 brands. So it's a consideration that you need to take as to whether or not it's good to go with a sophisticated family who have a huge head office with lots of brands, big accounting team, big marketing team, very good access to the lease locations and the shopping malls. But at the same time, quite often, some of these families are much bigger than the franchisor. So you can get a bit railroaded in negotiations. They have in-house legal teams that have done these deals over and over again. The problem also is if you're a cafeteria, they might have 10 other cafeteria brands. So if things go wrong, it's very easy for them to just remove your brand from the location and put in the next brand. And then when we start negotiating things like the non-compete clause, negotiations get tricky. If you're a burger brand, trying to negotiate them to not take another burger brand can be tough. So there's definitely some pros and cons with dealing with the bigger family groups. We also have some of the corporate the private equity funds who act as franchisees, who run it from a head office basis. We also have some individual and smaller companies that might have 1 or 2 franchises. Only now in the sort of last 5-10 years have we started to see individuals who have no other brands taking a franchise. Sometimes they can actually turn out to be the best franchisees because they are truly dedicated to your brand and they are working 24/7 for just your brand, and they haven't got their mind on all these other brands and other concepts. But obviously those individuals take a lot more training and marketing and love and care from their franchisor in order to make sure that they're a success. Also, just where I've got locations being strip malls and mega malls, it's very hot in the Middle East. And so obviously we have a lot of shopping malls with the air conditioning. We don't have as many strip malls or on the road sort of outlets. They are coming now in Dubai and in Saudi, but we don't have as many and they're not as popular, I would say, especially with somewhere like Dubai, where a lot of tourists go to the mega malls because the malls have got all the other tourist things in them. They've got the play centres, an ice rink, a ski slope, you know, the movie theatres. There's lots of other tourist things that people can do. And so you have to talk to your franchisees about that. Where are they actually planning to go and how are they trying to capture the market there? I've talked about the alcohol and pork. I'll talk about logistics because especially international brands don't really realize that out here, the franchisees do a lot more for their staff than what might be expected. So some franchisees arrange accommodation for their staff. All of the staff are on visas because you've got a very international expat population. And they will be arranging transportation for the staff to come from their accommodation to the outlet rather than just letting them work that out on themselves. So some franchisees appear to have more operating costs and overheads than what you would be expecting, but that is because of the culture out here of making sure that you are responsible for their accommodation, their healthcare, and their transportation to and from the outlet. Lourdes, I've got one more slide. So I'll just further commercial tips here. Choosing the right partner, I'm sure is obviously the most critical part of this because you're entering into a marriage for hopefully 10, 20, 30 years. It's hopefully not a short-term relationship. I've talked about partner due diligence. In the Middle East, it's very difficult to get really good legal quality due diligence. It's not easy for us to do a company search. Not a lot of things are the public record. And so we are reliant on franchisees giving us information like their trade license and their passport copies and information like that. So it can be a bit difficult. You won't get the same level of due diligence out here than you would if you were franchising in London, for example. I've put a bullet point here about negotiating sensible development schedules. Quite often, franchisees out here will say, I will open you 50 outlets in the next 5 years and it'll all be fine, and it won't be fine because you've got to actually negotiate a sensible development schedule. 1 or 2 a year is achievable. Anything higher than that, and it is actually really quite difficult. It is really quite difficult because we're talking big areas, especially Saudi Arabia. It's a very vast country with a big population. It is not so easy for a franchisee to say, I'm going to open 50 outlets in the next 5 years and 10 will be here and 10 will be here and 10 will be here, because they have to set up separate companies. They have to get a whole logistics arm together. You really need to sometimes temper the franchisee and say what is realistic or not. Because then when these development schedules get negotiated, everyone gets upset 3 years later because no one's meeting them. And then it becomes a problem. Territory fees and store opening fees I've put here, they will vary so widely out here. It's very much about the brand equity, who is the franchisee, what kind of money and financial backing they have. There are no set schedules for any of this. I've seen some very, very, what I consider strange figures, and they're very much negotiated commercially, and sometimes there seems to be no rhyme or reason to it, but it just is the way it is. So don't ask me what's a reasonable territory fee because I can't tell you. That also moves to the next about benchmarking royalties and commercial terms. Again, it's just very much what you negotiate with the franchisee. And then the final point about a franchise or head office. Some of our brands, of our clients, especially the American brands, because they're looking at opening up, say anything over 10 or 15 outlets, it can be very sensible for a franchisor to set up a head office out here, because we do have a different weekend. We work on Sundays through to Thursdays, so our weekend is Friday and Saturday. Obviously, with time differences, if you've got franchisees that are dialing head office for assistance and the time zone differences, it might be the middle of the night. Things here are open 7 days a week and from 6, 7 in the morning all the way through up to 2 a.m. at night or 3 a.m. at night. So most outlets are open for very long periods of time, and franchisees usually do need to call someone at the franchisor's head office. So it can be a smart move for a franchisor to set up a head office out here that has staff on the ground that can monitor and manage the franchisees and really assist them in real time, in the right time zone and on the right days of the week. I think, Lourdes, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Very, very interesting presentation, I think, where basically I think the culture difference makes it very relevant to take a look at the regulation, and not the other way around, I would guess. Okay. All right. Well, our next speaker is Nipun. Nipun, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lourdes, and thanks, Melissa. That was super interesting. I think there are a lot of features which will apply equally for India. Cultural considerations, vast country, great opportunity. So I think there's actually quite a lot that was sounding very familiar. There have been many brands, prominent brands, that have entered into India in the last 15 years. And in the last 10 years, particularly, India has had a good track record of its strong respect for corporate law and IPR protection, which sometimes externally isn't recognized, that the country has actually made very positive progress on these aspects. There is no single franchising piece of legislation in India, and there can still be relevant considerations that you need for different states across the country, because again, in the same way as Melissa was describing, it's a very vast, large country, and it's often difficult to end up with one partner, franchising partner, for the whole jurisdiction, because there are just such different vast considerations and local reach that is needed, even, for example, for the north and the south of the country. Having said all of that, there has been a very positive reform for retail and the ease of doing business in India in the last 5 years that has made India a very active and dynamic market. But you need to be on top of considerations such as tax, the change in which royalty is treated, and there are other key issues like employment, and there are aspects that they're evolving, because the last 10 years in how corporate and tax has evolved in the country is something that you have to be right on top of. Bird&Bird, we work very closely with Sudipta Routh of L&L, and no foreign law firm, no international law firm is permitted to practice Indian law. So we co-counsel with local lawyers, and Sudipta is one that we work closely with. So I'm going to hand over to Sudipta and the team to let them run us through some of the specifics.
Well, thank you so much, Nipun. Lourdes, may I use my own share screen, if it's okay?
Of course.
So, well, Nipun just gave us a fantastic overview of what we face in this jurisdiction. I'm going to focus more on the technical aspects. Much of what we have to deal with would come through in what we call our FDI policy, which is our foreign direct investment policy. Does this come up on the screen all right? Okay, fantastic. So we don't have franchising law in India like Saudi Arabia and many other countries. We actually have a patchwork quilt of regulations. You'd find the FDI policy, of course, is very central. There is real estate. Foreigners cannot own real estate in India. There is tax, of course, and the funny thing about tax is the questions always remain the same, but it's the answers that change every year. And IPRs, I'm happy to say, is fairly standard, and you'd expect a lot of this to follow English law. And there are standards which we are all familiar with in a variety of jurisdictions, so no surprise there. There's exchange control, which a lot of you would just not know about, because the last time any European country ever had exchange control was UK, and that was 1984. So we spend a lot of time simply telling our clients about exchange control regulations. We spend close to about 2-3 months, in fact, in any ordinary transaction, just explaining this inscrutable regulations which we have. There's customs, and there are, of course, sector-specific laws. I am going to only focus on the FDI policy, the tax aspects for today, because this is a vast subject. I would take about 2 months to explain everything. So I'm going to do a very summarized explanation of what is actually very complex. Hopefully I've got it right. So let's give it a try. So the first question that you'd obviously encounter is, how do you structure a franchise and a distribution model? And for this, we have to remember that non-residents are immediately disadvantaged, much like the protectionist laws in the Middle East. You have what are called entry routes. I call them entry routes. And you have entry conditions, which is given in our FDI policy. They're imposed by our exchange control laws. So what happens here is your negotiating position, the structure of your franchising, your agreements, and everything else in between gets distorted by this advantage which residents will always have. In fact, your brand's go-to-market strategies always, inevitably, they are impacted by entry routes and entry conditions. And a very important thing you must remember is, when you do come into India, 9 times out of 10, your franchising model will be very different from what you practice globally. So for you to internationalize your India strategy, it could take you close to 15 years, transitioning through a variety of options and conditions. So I'm going to take a look at a very summarized chart on conditions and the options which you have. You essentially would have 5 different options when you're considering franchising in India. If you're manufacturing in India, much of your problems are solved because you can simply sell whatever you manufacture in India. It's not a problem. But the condition and the fact of manufacturing in India itself, you can imagine it is a huge challenge. It'll take you close to 3 or 4 years. And if you're very speedy at reasonably setting up a manufacturing base. Then there's multi-brand retail trading. This is a very hotly contested sector of our economy, and we are not going to give it up in a hurry. There's going to be quite a fight before we are actually going to liberalize this area. But this really caters to the Tesco's of the world, the Carrefours of the world, the Walmarts of the world, and it is fraught with very difficult conditions. You're of course limited to only 51% ownership when you do enter India. Over and top of that, you will have to seek government approval from the Ministry of Finance. You're not going to be able to set up in all the states in India because we are a federal country. So states have a say in whether they would allow entry of that multi-brand supermarket brand or any other company into their states. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And even after you've gone through those 2 layers, you will be able to operate only in select cities. So there's a criteria which tells you which cities you can set up your stalls in. And then there is a very poisonous condition. 30% of your products sold must be sourced locally. And over and top of that, when they say locally, they say the medium and the small scale industries. So it's more from the cottage industries that you are asked to source. So obviously, foreign brands would have huge difficulty in trying to get standardized products which they manufacture in the world under global standards perfected over decades. And then to transfer that technology into what essentially is a cottage industry is a massive challenge. Then you have single brand retail trading. This is the sweet spot for franchising. And you're allowed to do this by first incorporating an entity in India. You cannot be offshore and then do single brand retail trading. You have to be in India. And if you hold more than 51% in that entity, then that 30% local sourcing requirement begins to apply again. So one way to avoid the local sourcing norm is to have a 51-49 joint venture with the Indian party controlling the 51%. This is exactly something which Starbucks has done. And you know that Starbucks essentially detests doing joint ventures. They would do it only in the rarest of circumstances. They have actually perfected franchising over 80, 90 years now. And the technology they bring on board with franchising is unparalleled. But in India, they did have to actually come in through a joint venture, and that's with the Tatas. Then you have cash and carry wholesale trading. This is where you set up an Indian entity as a franchisor, and that Indian entity begins to import, stock the products, provide warranty and repair services, and you set up franchising network, and that can be an omni-channel network with Indian partners. This is usually the route most brands use while entering into India. They find this to be the most suited for their needs. And when you do set up something like this, obviously you will have a long-term strategy in your mind when you do this. And you're able to, when you set up a cash and carry wholesale trading entity, you're only allowed to do B2C sales. And there's one other restriction, and that is 25% of your turnover is, if you set up an SBRT along with, which is single brand retail trading, if you set up your flagship store or your own channel or shop-in-shop structures, you cannot supply more than 25% to your own group entity. So you're constrained to have at least 75% of your products sold by other franchises. This is useful though, because it's very difficult in India, given the restrictions with respect to your entry, your exchange control regulation. Step-in rights is a massive problem. You can terminate easier than in the Middle East, from what I hear Melissa say. But the point is, step-in rights is almost impossible. Now, one way to mitigate that is to have your own single brand retail flagship store, and you can continue to still have 25% of your product being sold through the single brand retail store while you set up your franchising network all over again after termination. So that's something you might want to hold at the back of your mind when you do set up and you're considering whether you want to do SBRT or not. Then, of course, the easiest way of doing franchising, which obviously means that you have the least amount of control, is when you're offshore and you simply appoint local distributors, franchisees, or customers act as direct importers. There is obviously no entry conditions. It's only trade and tariff barriers. And here I must tell you that India has some of the highest tariff barriers, and we are now at present negotiating a bunch of FTAs. But our customs duty on luxury items especially are stupendously high. And obviously the offshore franchisor cannot own any real estate in India, so you have the least amount of control. So here we're going to just take a closer look at, okay. We're going to take a closer look at what these entry routes are all about. Now, this is terminology which I cooked up with about 2 decades of experiences that we've had. So it's not necessary that you'll find entry route 1, 2, or 3, and 4 in our regulations. The regulations are often written by bureaucrats, and you'd be hard-pressed to even find what I'm alluding to here. So I have graded these entry routes, and entry route 1 is, of course, where you are, let me just change the view a little, yeah, where you're offshore entry route is one where you set up your single brand retail entity. I'm not considering multi-brand retail, obviously, because that's for Tesco's of the world, where you set up a single brand retail entity. Now, as I said before, if you want to disapply the 30% local sourcing norms, then it's good for you to have a JV partner. And there are enough and more examples of that. And closer home for you would be Zara and Massimo Dutti. In fact, they set up quite a few years ago, and they set up joint ventures with Tata themselves. And then you have the joint venture entry route. Skechers is a shining example of a joint venture entry route with beautifully planned exits. And today Skechers is one of the most successful brands in a very short period of time. Then you have, of course, 4 and 5 are basically where you're offshore and you appoint either Indian channel partners or you sell directly to Indian customers. With digital e-commerce, it's very easy for you to actually access the Indian markets directly to the customers. I'm going to a little more about that, so hold your thought on that. I'll come back to it later. So if you look at the SBRT, which is a single brand retail route, the biggest problem is, of course, the local sourcing norms. Now, it depends. If you're an apparel or a footwear manufacturer, you might find it very easy to set up something like this. However, if you sell Swiss watches, there's not a chance you're ever going to manufacture in India. So it really depends on what products you franchise and what is it that your strategy is and what your business is all about. Where this local sourcing norm will either act to your advantage or to your disadvantage. Now, for something like EVs, for instance, electric vehicles, we have a great policy in India which really encourages the manufacturing of these vehicles. So there's a bunch of SOPs and incentives which really add to the advantage of foreign EV makers to actually come and set up in India. So that's just an example on how you can use these conditions differently. Then there are certain relaxations in the local sourcing norms. It's not like you have to start doing it from the first year itself. They usually take it in a block of 5 years. And they also say that, listen, it's not required that you have to use 30% local sourcing for your sales in India. You can use it for your global procurement. So I'm just out of a massive franchising transaction, which I was responsible for. It's for Birkenstock. It's a footwear company from Germany. And we found that we could actually import a lot of coir and cork from India and leather straps, really low-end items which can actually be manufactured by the cottage industry in India. So we can use all of that for our global sourcing. We used to source from Portugal, we used to source a lot from Africa, but we suddenly find that India is a fantastic place to source from, and it obviously adds to our SPRT unit here. So, and if you look at the cash and carry conditions, this is strictly wholesale. You are only permitted B2B operations. If you set up a cash and carry unit, you cannot sell, or you cannot even assist retail, in the sense that it's not a great idea for you to show advertising expenses for your franchisees, because then that would tantamount to actually assisting the retail, and that is usually looked upon with a jaundiced eye. So the advertising is done globally. It is done from your global headquarters, and now with social media and digital advertising, so that becomes really easy for you to achieve. Of course, you can have billboards in India, you can hire billboards, you cannot hire shop fronts, but billboards are not a problem. So it's always a great idea to run your campaigns from outside and then cross-charge the expenses. And I'm going to come on that a little more when I talk about tax. So this is how the mechanics really work. And what you should notice is that you're not actually constrained to using just one route, and they're not mutually exclusive. If you're clever, you'll be able to use perhaps all 5 in combinations. And we'll come to that again, and I will try and illustrate how that can be done quite successfully in this market. So these are some of those takeaways which we bring to you. It's distilled from our experiences in the last 10 years. This is not law, of course, but we can tell you how this all works out when you're trying to set up your structure. So each entry route will obviously offer a different balance of costs and benefits. So you have to figure out how much you're willing to spend to do that. Then the market penetration advantage. Now, if I just go back here, if you start looking from 5 to 1, obviously your market penetration is going to be the highest when you're at 1 and the lowest when you're at 5. And if you're using a combination, then your market penetration advantage increases disproportionately, logarithmic, in fact. And then there's revenue and growth and profit extraction, obviously. Profit extraction is very dependent on our exchange control regulations. It has a large number of ceilings as to what you can repatriate abroad. So it's a great idea for you to know all of these restrictions before you actually set up your financing model. Control over franchise, obviously that follows in step with market penetration. If you look at the entry conditions, these are progressively more burdensome as you move up the value chain. So entry route 5, of course, is the easiest. You can sit wherever you are in the world and just sell directly to Indian customers. Indian customers import and they pay the import duties. If you have a distributor, they do that. So the disadvantage is that it often takes about a month before the product you're selling would reach the Indian customer. And obviously, if a product is going to take a month to reach somebody, you can imagine that that's not very good for market penetration or brand recognition, or indeed even too much sales in this territory. Combined with very high customs duty, it's just a very insignificant sort of sales you may be able to achieve. It's of course most burdensome if you're trying to establish multi-brand retail. Tesco's, they came in 2012, and we still haven't seen a Tesco's outlet, not even an express outlet. So you can bet that it's going to take another 5 years before they even think of putting up a supermarket in India. They do have some sort of logistics hub in the southern city of Bangalore, but that's been around for the last 6 years without causing a ripple in our market. Carrefour contemplated coming to India at least 7 times, but I think they've given up now. So now these factors, of course, is going to impact your revenue extraction, your ability to provide warranty support and repair, as you can guess. So you'll have to build all of this into your consideration of which entry route or which combination of entry routes you want to choose. And as I've been saying, a multi-pronged strategy is perhaps the best in this market because of the number of things you can use. I was going to go and talk about a few examples as well. So most brands, invariably, they would use route 4 and 5, which is your offshore. And then you set up an Indian distributor, you start building up that relationship. And then you do entry route 3, which is setting up a cash and carry wholesale trading entity in India. So how you progress in that is, if you look at the watch brands in India, they've had distributor relationships for 10 years, maybe 15 years. And then once they've got their act together, they start their stocking hubs in India, and they are able to then service those distributors much better. They're able to cut down the time in deliveries by, say, 15 days. And with new technology in logistics, they're able to provide far better warranty support and repair services to the distributor. So it's a win situation for the franchisors and the franchisee to have this distribution cash and carry hub in India. Then, of course, like I said, it always also makes sense for you to have a combination of single brand retail trading. You can perhaps run your flagship stores using this route, and it also keeps your franchises on their toes. They know that you've already gone to the market, and these flagship stores are really prestige stores. So it also helps the franchise network mainly to keep them on their toes and disciplined. And they also know that if there's an issue, it's much like the headquarters, which Melissa was talking about. When you have this flagship stores, a lot of your local issues and your look and feel, your operations manual, your advertising spend, all of these get far better coordinated. So you'll find that Nike, Adidas, Skechers, Birkenstock, Onitsuka Tiger, they all try and get there to an SBRT retail unit while they're running their CNC or their cash and carry wholesale units as well. So you can use these entry routes and entry conditions in combination to achieve what we call omni-channel distribution. And if you recall, I told you that it's inevitable that your franchising strategy is not going to be the one you follow globally, internationally. For India, it's obviously going to be very different. But these combinations and this use of this entry conditions and routes in different ways helps you actually sink closer to your global retail strategy. So it's one of those very important things to know that, you'll have to fit in shoe and then figure out how you can expand from there. Then one other thing, of course, this is a structuring innovation, where you have variety of entities, variety of ways of doing things. But what has happened now in the last 5 or 6 years is, of course, technology. So remember, I told you India is an exchange control regulation, exchange control jurisdiction. Now, if you are to control foreign exchange remittances and inward and outward remittances, obviously you'd have to have payment systems which are regulated by the central bank, right? But with technology, that is beginning to change quite a bit. Now imagine a world where we've actually moved to Bitcoins. There is no central regulations anymore. It's all decentralized. And how on earth is India going to really implement its exchange control is the moot point today. We haven't obviously got there, but 10 years from now, who knows? You have Internet 2.0, and these regulations would look completely different. They would be upended, absolutely. Technology has another advantage. What happens now is through e-commerce, you are able to actually offer the same look and feel through your websites or web shops across the world. The only difference is pricing, and that's because of customs. So what looked like a CNC operation or what looked like a wholesale operation, but because you have a very strong digital e-commerce franchisee globally, you are able to offer exactly the same products at exactly the price range would differ, but the Indian customer, for once, is exposed to something which is standard across the world. There is no longer the requirement for you to do something which is bespoke for India and hence of a lower quality or hence of a dated quality. So technology has done a lot of that, and in the 5 years we've seen even the cash and carry wholesale networks, when they hand out their digital franchises to Indian partners, you would see that those web shops are actually in their own names. So Birkenstock has its own, Onitsuka Tiger has its own, Skechers have their own, Hubler has their own. So it looks like as if they're doing retail. So the distinctions, the regulatory barriers and the distinctions which were intended before, they seem to blur out a lot because of technology. I'll come back again to this. Anywhere is really a balancing act, and that's how we see it in India as well. If you look at the offshore routes, obviously there is little or no impact on you other than the risk of establishing what we call a permanent establishment in India. It's a customs duty that you'll have to worry about. If there are royalty payments to be made from the Indian franchisees, we have a very strange pick-in situation where the royalty is actually added on to the customs duty. So you will face issues of that nature, but those are really peripheral in how you structure your franchising from an offshore point of view. But when you get onshore, that's when the Indian complexities and the idiosyncrasies start to hit you. So you have differing ability to repatriate. When you're doing your cross-charge agreements or when you're doing reimbursement of advertisement spends, you will start noticing the Indianness of all of these. And you'll have to take into consideration how exactly these tax rates operate to get to a system which is efficient. Then we, of course, had very badly implemented GST, which is the goods and services tax. It's akin to VAT, but we still have a lot of problems in implementing this. It is complex and it has far too many moving parts for us to actually get a handle on and figure out with complete surety that something works or not. So that's something which you will have to again learn as you come in, and something which you will have to deal with on a daily basis. In India, once you set up in India, our revenue extractions are obviously determined by the tax rates and how they operate. So we don't really dividend proceeds to the holding companies. The payment is really through royalties, they are through buying commissions, through license fees, expenses or reimbursements through cross charges. These are far more efficient than dividend restructuring because dividend attracts corporate taxation and they have different slabs. So you'll find nearly everyone, 99% of the foreign brands would do a combination of the heads I set out here. Royalties, of course, is coming under scrutiny increasingly. And there is now also the proposal to charge GST or VAT on royalty, which would probably require the brands to again restructure around what they see should be the most efficient tax structure here. Once you enter India, now I know this is a very busy slide, but what we're trying to say here is that you will have to do a balancing act, and the balancing act arises from customs, which is a special valuation test, and from transfer pricing. So what transfer pricing tries to do for the local entity is they will try to ascertain the prices of the goods and services which you pay to your foreign affiliates, and they would claim that these are inflated so as to bring down your income, which is exigible to income tax in India. So your transfer pricing will always come under scrutiny. And in India, transfer pricing has often been equated with tax terrorism, where the government really gets behind you and they make the claim that you will have to prove otherwise. On the other side is customs. And here the tax authorities work in a diametrically opposite manner. They would try and say that the import value of the products are deflated. And that's the reason you're paying lower customs duty. Now you prove to us why they are not deflated. It may seem easy. You can look at global pricing charts and get it, but it isn't easy in reality. It's very difficult because for you to establish a pricing strategy, if you've had a low-priced sort of a commodity for the Indian markets, especially because Indian markets are very price sensitive, you can get into a lot of trouble with the special valuation branch, and which can really throw your pricing strategy off gear. So it's a very piquant balancing act which you have to manage here, and that's the reason the cash and carry models usually follow a very low margin sort of a model, and you'd find the SBRTs also, they turn profitable much later than one would expect. And much of that comes from this balancing act with tax. So it's good to see a few models here, how folks have actually used the entry routes and their combinations to set up in India. Swatch is a fantastic example, because Swatch today has a revenue of 71 million euros. I'll just change the view for a bit. Yeah, so Swatch set up in 2004. They had a cash and carry setup in India. By 2015 and 16, it's almost like 11 years later that they set up their first SBRT. Sorry, it says Nike there, it should be Swatch. Okay, here, sorry. So Swatch today uses all three routes in combination, which is something we were talking about. They set up they have several brands as well, as you can see. There's Rado, Tissot, Mega, Brego, Roger, Swatch. So they've been using this two-company route, which is wholesale cash and carry, and of course their single retail shop. They have network of about 450 franchisees, and they have about 8 to 9 single brand shops for Swatch. And much of the high-end brands are actually only sold by the franchisees. They also have a digital platform, and they've given out two digital franchisees to two players in India with whom they've had a relationship for about 10 years. So if you look at their operations here, you see that they are actually loss-making on the cash and carry side. They have a loss of 1.1 million euros. Yeah, but it really doesn't matter to them in the way they position their brand and the kind of sales they're able to generate. And if you look at the revenue, it's been growing year on year, and it's been a very steady growth. Their strategy seems to be very well oiled. They understand the entry routes and the entry conditions, and they've been using that to great advantage. So if you look at the SBRT, the small little graph on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see that the revenue, it's not really great. It's about 614,000 euros only, and they have a profit of 23,000 euros. So you know that they use that mainly as their flagship shop. They use that to provide services to the other franchisees. They're not actually competing with the Indian franchisee network, but their presence is in there. And when you look at their revenue extraction models, they have steadily, they've been extracting the revenues in those routes which we were discussing. They pay their foreign holding companies, they pay them buying commissions, and they pay them for their advertisement spends. Now, because they have this SBRT or the single brand retail entity, they're obviously subject to the local sourcing norms. So here what they do really is the packaging material for Swatch watches. Some of them also have belts and other plastic parts which go onto the Swatch watches, which are manufactured in India. And this is, of course, they're procuring all of this on a global basis. So it services all of their other brands outside as well. And obviously the CNC entity here cannot supply more than 25% to the SPRT entity, which obviously therefore also depresses their revenue. So this is Skechers. This is implementation, one of the best strategies that we've seen in the retail sector. Skechers entered into a joint venture with the Future Group in India, and they used obviously the JV route, which is entry route 2. By 2014, they also had their first single brand retail store. And in 2019, they bought out the Future Group. Now, obviously that there was a lot of exit planning strategy, which was baked into that joint venture. But even in this market, we felt that the price which Skechers managed to pay to buy out Future Group is relatively small. If you look at global standards. So this was something which they had already planned. The divorce was probably planned at the time of the marriage. We've had an in on Skechers a couple of times, and we did notice that the pricing which you see here was actually thought out 6 years ago. So they knew what they were doing. They had a very clear idea of how they are going to come into India and how they're going to expand. And they knew that they had a very strong partner in the Future Group, but they planned it so well that the transition was remarkably smooth. So it just shows that Skechers did a very good analysis of the entry regions which were applicable at that stage. And of course, with every success, there are obviously 5 or 6 failures. And the biggest failure, I wouldn't call it a failure really, it's just that Nike never really got their act together on the entry routes. So Nike started in August 2004. They had a cash and carry wholesale trading company which was set up. In 2015-16, they got their first approval. And in those days, you had to seek approval for single brand retail trading. It no longer exists. That has been liberalized. But Nike spent 2 years getting this approval, only to put it in suspension. They just decided, hey, no, we're not going to do SPRT in India. And then in 2019, Nike withdrew from most of its franchise agreements because they didn't really read it well. They weren't able to manage the network too well. And they had one principal franchisee called the Sports Station India Private Limited. They've been associated with Nike from 1995, from the time Nike was actually just doing offshore imports. So today, Nike simply operates a proprietary global platform, and that's across the world, and it's called Nike.com. Obviously, this is actually operated by eShop World. This is a global franchise, and this digital franchise is given globally to eShop World. And Nike also uses the e-commerce marketplace in India through Myntra, Flipkart, and of course SSIPL. Again, their revenue extraction is a combination of royalty, buying commissions, interest payments. They actually put in a large amount of shareholder loans into the entity, and they're able to extract some amount of interest income out of that. Then, of course, they cross-charge their expenses. So if you look at how they went about, if you look at the graph, then you'll notice a massive dip in 2016. That's when the wheels came off their strategy in India. They did manage to come up. Yeah.
Sudipta, sorry, can I just pause you for a second? I just wanted to check with Lourdes and others as to how much more time we have for India, so that there's enough time for any questions. Or do we have enough more? Do we have enough time, Lourdes?
Yes, Nipun, you're right. No, I was going to say the idea is to finish. In fact, I think we've run out of time.
Yeah.
It's that the idea was to close at 11 and
Okay.
to give some times for questions if needed.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I think what's very apparent from all the detail that Sudipta has given is that there have been some fabulous success stories. It's actually a very developed market. It's come a long way from the 90s when it was a bit more hit and miss. And in the way of any strong opportunity, you have to plan carefully and have a careful developed thought process as to how your plan is evolved and what your plan is over 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, so that you can try and implement that. So before we sort of round that up, is there any other very critical point you want to make, or then we'll hand back to Lourdes so that we give everyone an opportunity to ask questions.
This is the last slide. I was on the last slide, so
perfect.
It's a happy coincidence. This is something I already spoke about to you before, and you have to look at our regulatory barriers and also our national barriers from the lens of technology. And what you'll notice is that technology has actually melted some of those regulatory barriers altogether. The newer entrants in the market have been able to use technology in a very disruptive way, both in the way they sell and also in the way they provide their logistics. So this is something which the regulatory response to this technology is only about starting now. So this is a space which is well worth watching, and that should get you, a big advantage if you move into India now on the back of technology and of course your structure innovations. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sudipta. No, very, very interesting. And as Nipun was saying, it's incredibly detailed, success stories that are very, very relevant. I think we are seeing, all of us are seeing, in fact, that disruption by technology that is changing, in fact, the scenarios and sometimes making the regulations not as fit, maybe. And of course, technology is changing much faster than regulations. So yeah, I think we're finished with this. But Juan Carlos, Veronica, thank you a lot. Thanks a lot for this opportunity again. Is there any questions that have been popped in, Veronica, into the chat?
No, no questions. So we are fine.
Okay. All right. So it's been a pleasure as always. Please do reach out and with any issues that you may have. And of course, these are some of the jurisdictions. There are other jurisdictions that we could talk about. So please reach out if you have any concerns or you're thinking about any other jurisdiction that we can help with.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Juan
Thank you
Carlos.
very much, all people, for this presentation. It has been a very interesting presentation regards for us. Thanks, Lourdes. Muchísimas gracias. El año que viene más webinars, imagino.
Eso es. Hombre,
contamos
claro.
con nuestros socios Bird&Bird para que el año que viene podamos conocer más de cerca la franquicia en otros países. Recordamos que en este año hemos conocido más de cerca la franquicia en Polonia, en Reino Unido, en Holanda, en Australia, en China, Italia, Francia, Marruecos y hoy en India y en Oriente Medio. Así que los emplazamos a todos para que el año que viene sigamos conociendo más países.
Estupendo, estaremos encantados.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much.
Hasta luego. Gracias.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.